Jamal ran as fast as he could, his heart pounding. A few feet away, a police officer lay on the pavement, struggling to breathe. Blood soaked through her uniform as she clutched her swollen belly. "Help me," she whispered weakly. But the street was empty. No one else was around. It was up to him. Jamal had been taught to be cautious around the police. His mother always told him, "Stay out of trouble. Keep your head down." But now, a pregnant woman's life and her baby's depended on him. What he did next would change everything. And when the truth came out, the officer did something that left his entire family in shock. What happened next was unbelievable. Before we dive in, comment where you're watching from. And if you believe in kindness and justice, hit that subscribe button. Jamal froze for just a second, staring at the injured officer on the ground. Blood spread across her shirt as she clutched her stomach, her breaths coming out ragged and weak. She was pregnant, she needed help, and no one else was there. Jamal swallowed hard, glancing around the empty street. His mother's words rang in his head. "Be careful around the police, Jamal. Don't get involved. Just walk away." But how could he? A life was on the line. Taking a deep breath, he made his choice. He ran forward, dropping to his knees beside her. At just 12 years old, Jamal had already learned that life wasn't fair. A hard-working and responsible kid, he took care of his 6-year-old sister, Maya, while his mother worked 2 jobs. He loved basketball and science, dreaming of becoming a doctor one day. But in his neighborhood, people didn't expect much from boys like him. Jamal was used to being judged. Every time he walked into a store, the workers watched him like he might steal something. Every time he walked home from school, the police slowed down, checking him out. He hated it. Still, his mother always told him, "Be better, Jamal. Don't let them define you." And right now, that's exactly what he planned to do. Officer Rachel Carter wasn't a bad cop. She was tough, hard-working, and dedicated to protecting people. But she wasn't perfect. She worked in a high-crime area, and over time she'd developed her own biases. She wasn't openly racist, but deep down, she saw young black boys like Jamal as potential trouble. Even now, as she lay on the ground, bleeding and in pain, a part of her hesitated when she saw him running toward her. But he was all she had. Her backup wasn't coming fast enough. And her baby needed her to survive. The street was quiet and empty. A few blocks away, kids played basketball, their shouts echoing through the air. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows against the sidewalk. The smell of food from a nearby corner store drifted through the air. But here, there was only silence. Officer Carter's radio crackled as she tried to call for help again, her hand shaking. "Officer down. Request backup?" Her voice was too weak. Jamal tightened his fists. He couldn't just stand there. So he did the only thing he could. He leaned down and pressed his hands against her wound. Her eyes widened in shock. Jamal met her gaze. "I got you," he said. And just like that, everything changed. Jamal pressed both hands firmly against Officer Carter's wound, just like he had seen in a medical video once. She winced in pain, her breathing shaky, but she didn't push him away. She needed him. "Hang on," Jamal said, his voice steady, even though his heart was racing. "Help is coming." Officer Carter's eyes flickered with uncertainty. She wasn't used to trusting strangers, especially not a black boy from this neighborhood. But right now, she had no choice. Jamal glanced around nervously. The street was still empty. No witnesses. The shooter was gone, but what if he came back? Officer Carter's radio crackled again, but her voice was too weak to respond. Jamal's mind raced. He needed to get help. But how? If he left, she might not make it. If he stayed, she might die in his arms. For a brief second, he considered running. Wouldn't that be easier? Then he heard a soft, trembling voice. "Please," Officer Carter whispered. "Don't leave me." Jamal swallowed hard. He wasn't going anywhere. Jamal spotted her phone on the ground just out of reach. "Can you move?" he asked. Officer Carter shook her head weakly. Jamal took a deep breath and crawled toward the phone. He grabbed it and quickly dialed 911. "This is Jamal Carter," he said, keeping his voice calm. "I'm with a police officer. She's been shot. She's pregnant. She needs help now." The dispatcher's voice was sharp. "Where are you, Jamal?" He quickly gave the address. "Stay with her," the dispatcher said. "Help is on the way." Jamal nodded to himself. He could do that. But then, the sound of footsteps. His stomach clenched. Someone was coming. Jamal looked up and saw a figure at the end of the street. The shooter. He was watching them. Jamal's pulse spiked. His entire body screamed at him to run. But if he ran, Officer Carter would die. He had to think fast. Jamal acted on instinct. He grabbed a brick from the sidewalk. He shifted his position to shield Officer Carter. He locked eyes with the shooter. The man took a step forward. Jamal's grip on the brick tightened. "I called the cops," he said, his voice steady, even though he was terrified. "They'll be here any second." For a moment, the man hesitated. Then, from a distance, sirens. The shooter cursed under his breath and took off running. Jamal let out a shaky breath. He had done it. Jamal turned back to Officer Carter. Her eyes were glassy, unfocused. She was losing too much blood. He reached for her hand. "Stay with me," he pleaded. "They're almost here." But Officer Carter's eyes fluttered closed. Jamal's heart pounded. Was she going to make it? Jamal gripped Officer Carter's hand tightly. Her eyelids fluttered, her body limp. She was slipping away. The sirens grew louder, but Jamal wasn't sure if they would get here in time. "Stay with me," he whispered. "Please." She didn't respond. Panic swelled in his chest. He couldn't let her die. Not after everything he had done to keep her alive. Jamal did the only thing he could think of. He started talking to her. "Hey, Officer Carter, I bet you don't know this, but I want to be a doctor one day," Jamal said, his voice shaking. Her eyes twitched slightly, a good sign. "My mom says I'm smart enough to do it," he continued. "But some people, they look at me and just see some kid from the streets." Jamal swallowed hard. "I guess you probably thought the same about me, huh?" He wasn't sure why he said it. Maybe because it was the truth. Maybe because he needed her to hear it. Finally, red and blue lights flashed against the buildings. A police car skidded to a stop and 2 officers jumped out. Jamal felt relief flood his body until he saw the way they looked at him. One of the officers immediately reached for his gun. "Step away from the officer. Hands up." Jamal's stomach dropped. Jamal raised his hands slowly. "I'm helping her," he shouted. "She's hurt. She's pregnant. You gotta—" "I said step back," the officer barked, taking a step forward. Jamal froze. For the first time that night he felt helpless. They thought he did this. The realization hit him like a punch. His heart pounded in his ears. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. Would they even listen? Then a weak voice cut through the chaos. "Stop!" The officers stiffened. Jamal turned, eyes wide. Officer Carter was awake. Barely. But she had just enough strength to speak. "He saved me." Her words hit like a shock wave. The officers looked at each other, their grip on their weapons loosening. Jamal let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. One of the officers quickly knelt beside Officer Carter, pressing on her wound. "You're gonna be okay, Rachel. Medics are almost here." She turned her head slightly, looking at Jamal. "Thank you." Jamal blinked. It was just 2 words. But coming from her, a police officer, someone who might have once judged him differently, it meant everything. Minutes later, paramedics arrived. They rushed Officer Carter into the ambulance, checking her vital signs. One of the paramedics, a woman with kind eyes, turned to Jamal. "You kept pressure on the wound?" she asked. Jamal nodded, still shaken. She smiled. "You saved her life, kid." Jamal looked down at his blood-covered hands. He had done that. He had saved her. As the ambulance doors slammed shut, one of the officers approached Jamal. "Your name, kid?" "Jamal Carter." The officer's eyes widened. "Wait, Carter?" He turned to the other officer. "You don't think—" Jamal frowned. What was going on? Jamal shifted uncomfortably under the officer's gaze. "Carter," the officer repeated, eyes narrowing. "Are you related to Officer Rachel Carter?" Jamal's brows furrowed. "Number I don't even know her." The officer hesitated, then nodded. "All right, kid. We'll be in touch." Jamal didn't know what that meant, but at that moment he didn't care. His hands were still covered in blood, his heart still racing. He had done everything he could. Now, he just wanted to go home. That night, Jamal sat at the kitchen table picking at his dinner. His mother, a tired but strong woman, sat across from him, watching him carefully. "You're quiet," she said. Jamal shrugged. "I saw you on the news," she continued, placing her fork down. "They said a boy saved a pregnant officer's life." Jamal's head snapped up. "It was you, wasn't it?" He hesitated, then nodded. His mother let out a slow breath. "Jamal, you could have been hurt." "I know," he admitted, "but she needed help." His mother studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I'm proud of you," she said softly. Jamal felt his chest tighten. He hadn't realized how much he needed to hear that. The next evening, a knock at the door startled them. Jamal's mother looked through the peephole, then gasped. "What is it?" Jamal asked. She turned to him, eyes wide. "It's her." Jamal's stomach flipped. She opened the door, and there stood Officer Rachel Carter, in civilian clothes. Her face was still pale, her movements slow. But she was standing, alive. And she was here for him. Officer Carter took a deep breath. "Jamal, I don't even know how to thank you." Jamal shifted awkwardly. "You don't have to." She shook her head. "Number I do." She reached into her bag and pulled out a thick envelope. "I spoke with some people," she said, "and I made a few calls." Jamal hesitated before taking the envelope. When he opened it, his eyes widened. Inside was a full scholarship offer to one of the best private schools in the city. Jamal's mother gasped. This can't be real." Officer Carter smiled. "It is. Jamal, you saved my life, and my baby's. The least I could do was make sure you have the future you deserve." Jamal felt his throat tighten. He had expected a thank you, maybe a handshake. But this was life-changing. I don't know what to say," he stammered. Officer Carter smiled. "Say yes." Jamal's mother covered her mouth, tears in her eyes. After a long moment, Jamal nodded. "Yeah," he whispered. "Yes." Officer Carter exhaled, relieved. And for the first time, Jamal believed that maybe, just maybe, good things could happen to kids like him. Jamal sat in stunned silence, staring at the scholarship papers in his hands. This couldn't be real. A full scholarship? To one of the best private schools in the city. For him? His mother wiped a tear from her cheek, her hands trembling as she held the paper. "Jamal, this is unbelievable." Officer Carter smiled. "Believe it. You earned this." Jamal looked up at her, still trying to process everything. "I didn't do it for a reward." "I know," she said gently. "That's why you deserve it even more." His mother reached for his hand, squeezing it tight. Do you understand what this means, baby? Your whole life is about to change. Jamal swallowed hard. I don't know what to say. Officer Carter leaned forward, her expression serious but warm. Then just say yes. For a long moment, the weight of everything hung in the air. Then Jamal nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. Yes. That night, Jamal lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. His mind replayed everything that had happened over the last few days. The gunshot, the choice to help, the moment he thought the police would turn on him, Officer Carter standing up for him, and now this. One decision, one act of kindness had changed everything. For so long he had believed that no one truly saw kids like him, that no one believed in them, but Officer Carter had. She had looked beyond assumptions and given him a chance to dream bigger than he ever had before. And for the first time, he let himself believe he deserved it. The next day, Jamal's story spread across the neighborhood. People at the local store recognized him. A woman stopped him on the sidewalk. "You're the kid who saved that officer, aren't you?" Jamal hesitated, unsure what to say. She smiled. "You made us proud." For the first time, he felt something different. Respect. Not because of fear, not because of assumptions, but because of who he was. Even kids at the basketball court, who had never paid much attention to him before, started treating him differently. "Yo, Jamal," one of them called out. "We saw you on the news, man." That was crazy. Another boy clapped him on the back. "You're a hero now." Jamal chuckled, shaking his head. "I just did what anyone should do," he said. But deep down, he knew. Not everyone would have. Meanwhile, across town, Richard, the shooter, was arrested. He was caught by police after a citywide manhunt. He already had a long criminal record. He was charged with attempted murder and resisting arrest. Officer Carter was recovering well, and doctors had confirmed that her baby was safe. Jamal saw the news on TV. She had survived. Richard hadn't won. Jamal smiled to himself. Justice had been served. Over the next few weeks, Officer Carter and Jamal stayed in touch. She visited his family. She helped him prepare for his new school. She even taught him some basic self-defense moves. One afternoon, she brought him something special. A stethoscope. "For when you become a doctor," she said with a smile. Jamal laughed. "That's a long way from now." Officer Carter nodded. "Maybe. But you've already proven you're ready for big things." Jamal looked at the stethoscope, his dream feeling closer than ever. He had always believed he could be a doctor one day, but now he believed he actually would. One day, Jamal asked Officer Carter a question. "Did you judge me before?" She hesitated, then sighed. "I think I did," she admitted. "Not because I wanted to, but because of everything I was taught, everything I thought I knew." She looked him in the eye. "I was wrong." Jamal nodded. "I'm glad I got to prove it," he said. Officer Carter smiled. "Me too." Jamal started his first day at the new school with nervous excitement. Everything was different. The halls were bigger. The classes were harder. The students were from a different world than his, but Jamal knew one thing. He belonged here, because he had earned it. At lunchtime, as he sat down alone, a group of students walked over. "Hey," a boy said. "You're Jamal, right? The kid who saved that cop?" Jamal nodded slowly. The boy grinned. "That's crazy, man. You're kind of famous." Jamal smirked. "Guess so." Another kid pulled out his phone. "Dude, did you see the news? They're calling you the brave kid from the block." Jamal chuckled, shaking his head. "That's kinda corny." The group laughed, and one of them gestured for him to join their table. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like an outsider. As he walked into his next class, He heard Officer Carter's words in his mind. One act of kindness can change everything. People can surprise you. Never let the world tell you what you can't do. And as Jamal took his seat, he smiled. Because this was just the beginning. Jamal sat on the steps of his new school, watching the city around him. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel invisible. He had always wanted to be someone, to make a difference. But he never thought it would happen like this. One decision, one act of kindness, had changed everything. This story isn't just about Jamal. It's about every kid who is judged before they're even given a chance. It's about every person who steps up to do the right thing, even when it's hard. And most of all, it's about what happens when we see each other for who we really are. Because in the end, kindness is stronger than fear. What would you have done in Jamal's place? Do you think one act of kindness can really change a life? Let's talk in the comments. Your voice matters. And if you believe in justice, hope, and doing what's right, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Because these stories, they need to be told.